Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the second chapter of Paul's first epistle to the Thessalonians. We made it all the way up until the 16th verse, and that what we're going to cover today, it begins in the 17th verse and ends all the way in the 13th verse. And the thing we want to establish is that the division of the Bible into chapters are not natural. They were originally arranged in paragraph form, and it wasn't until the formation of the Latin Vulgate that they started to divide them into chapters with verses. And so one of the ways I personally would have done it is to arrange what begins in verse 17 as joined to the third chapter, but I wasn't there, so I have to, but also this makes a more equal amount of material to work with from which to make a lesson. And so we're just going to review what we covered in the previous lesson. Remember, that's the first 16 verses, verse 4. But as we have been approved by Elohim to be entrusted with the good news, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but Elohim, who proves our hearts. Study to show thyself approved, 1 Timothy 2:15. Paul was approved, and he had been entrusted with the responsibility of the good news and some of its more revolutionary mysteries. And a lot of this the world didn't like, and the world were not to expect the affection or tolerance of the world, but he was approved. So the word Elohim, proves our hearts, is why he was approved. So the proving and the being approved are connected. Then verse 8, so having a tender affection for you, we were well pleased to share with you not only the good news of Elohim, but also our own lives, because you have become beloved to us. So Paul is writing to an intimate audience. He's writing intimate to a people who, even though he's not there in them with body, he's certainly always there in spirit with them. He prays for them night and day in one of the verses we're going to be covering. And there's the element of unceasingness also in the 13th verse. And because of this, we thank Elohim without ceasing, that when you have received the word of Yahweh, which you heard from us, you welcomed it not as the word of men, but also as it is truly the word of Yahweh, which also works in you who believe. So there's an element of perpetuity in Paul's prayer and gratitude, and he encourages them to pray without ceasing in the 19th verse of the 5th chapter of this book, I believe. I could be wrong, but it's somewhere near that range. But there's no limit to what of causes we have to be grateful of him to him for. And Paul was doing what he had been faithfully entrusted and commissioned and approved and proven through the process. Of entrusted to spreading the good news, which men accepted as the word of Yahweh, and not as something more than the word of men. So even though they didn't please the men, we earlier read, they had the approval and the pleasant. They had the pleasure of Yahweh, which they could bask in. And then he says something, there's Jewish interference. The same people who killed the Master and the Messiah was forbidding them to evangelize amongst Gentiles, but there was nothing that could stop a man like Paul once he had set in motion to take it all the way. So 17th verse, but we, brothers, having been taken away from you for a short while, in presence, not in heart, were much more eagerly trying to see your face with much longing. So the we is the royal we. This is Paul personally. It's just the grammatic, but he considers them his brothers and spiritual siblings, and he considers himself orphan, taken away. That the Greek has the connotation or entailment of it's applicable, often applied in reference to orphans being taken away from parents. But Paul is aware that his orphan state is only going to last. He's elsewhere. He's not in their presence. He's not in their midst physically, but he is there in heart and in spirit. and he really wants to see them face to face. He has this longing, a great longing within him that must be satisfied, and eventually is. We would therefore have come to you, I indeed, Paul, more than once, but Satan hindered us. Satan was busy and actively engaged in Paul's ministry. Paul was acutely aware of this, and one of the blessings and benefits of encountering Satan as frequently as he did is he gained very keen insights in our spiritual warfare for victorious formula, because Satan threw everything at him. He threw a thorn in his flesh and so much there. So Paul has a lot of interesting insights on the concept of Satan. And if you know nothing of Satan, that means you haven't traveled anywhere with God at all, because the more intimately you will know the latter, the more fully you will understand the former. For what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting? Is it not even before our Master Yahshua Messiah at his coming? So he's asking a question, and there's a reference to the second coming in every single chapter of the First Thessalonians. And this is their hope and joy, and the crown isn't guaranteed, but it'll be a crown worth boasting on. Paul speaks often of crowns, that is the throne of salvation, which the saved wear in heaven, and it all is connected to his second coming. It's not going to happen before then. It's going to happen after and because of the second coming. So then, for you are our esteem and joy. So again, once more, he considers these people he earlier calls brothers his esteem and joy. He's not with them, but he's growing with them. He's there with them in heart and spirit, even though he's not with them in person. So when we could no longer stand it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone. This is what the Vulgate authors deemed the beginning of the 3rd chapter, and this reminds us to what they located as the 17th chapter in the book of Acts. So there's a missionary timetable and timeline between the Thessalonians was after Galatians. This is the second earliest chronological epistle of Paul, but the evangelism occurred mostly in his second missionary activity. After Philippi, they made their way down into Athens, so that represents Europeans. And while he was in Athens, he sent Timothy, our brother and servant of Elohim, and our fellow worker in the good news of Messiah, to establish you and to encourage you concerning your faith. So there's 3 places that Paul evangelizes in the 17th chapter of Acts. The first of which is Thessalonica. That's the city to whom this epistle is directed in the first 8 verses. Then we read of Berea from 9 to 14. Then we find him in Athens. And just to summarize what happened, each one as concisely as possible, they received they attracted an audience, but also active envy and hostility from Jews who expelled them, who summoned the Roman masters on them for preaching of the king they called Yahshua. And then in Bereans, we find an assembly that was genuinely dedicated and curious to learn as much as they could in the Word. These people spent time in study and prayer, and it was good there. Then in Athens, he delivers one of his best sermons ever, but does not yield the most abundant crop. But Timothy and Silas were sent for, and there's no indication that they came, but we can give them the benefit of the doubt that they did. That no one should be unsettled by these persecutions, for you yourselves know that we are appointed to this. So when we think of the pains and struggles and trials and tribulations that we incur in the walk of our faith, they're not accidents, they're appointments. They are destined, they are placed in test by the providential one who places them in our path in order that we may grow through the furnace of affliction if necessary. And it was certainly a lot more challenging to be a Christian in the 1st century AD than it is, at least in 21st century America. But then again, there are parts all over the world where we are being slaughtered as we speak. So no but no two places and times are exactly alike. For indeed we informed you beforehand, when we were with you, that we would suffer persecution, and so it came to be, as you know. So he promised them that they would suffer persecution. He said that the message he came with carried persecutions among those who proclaim it and live by it and embody it in essence. It's part of the calling, persecution. And sure enough, they had lived and experienced the fulfillment of his promise. And it was made known, so he says, as you know. Because of it, when I could no longer stand it, I sent to find out about your faith, lest the tempting one might have tempted you, and our labor should be in vain. So the tempting one is, of course, Satan again, and Paul is aware that Satan is not personally aligned against him alone. He is the author of evil everywhere, and he can be interfering with the seed and scattering the seed that was sown in Thessalonia to the winds, distorting the fruit of the tree which is planted from them. So he's aware that he is capable. His minions are everywhere. So he's not exactly omnipresent, but he is the Elohim of this world. So there is no place where he is not trying to get into. There is no soul he does not delight in corrupting. So he's aware that Satan realizes it makes strategic sense for him to be aligned against there, and he can get in the way and make everything that Paul had worked for and built up desolate and ruined. But now that Timothy has come to us from you, and having brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have good remembrance of us, longing to see us, as we also you. So Timothy, he expressed an honest worry, and it is a statement of doubt, but the doubt is alleviated by the positive, optimistic report from Timothy, his beloved co-worker, the recipient of 2 inspired epistles classified as pastoral epistles. He was his pastoral protege, who he likened to as his co-worker and fellow laborer, and had nothing but the utmost affection for, more so than Titus, I would say. And he delivered what he had been summoned to deliver. He gave them the good news, the positive report card, the honest assessment of the quality of their faith and love, which is glowing and alive and sustaining them, and that they longed to see the one who had personally evangelized it. But Paul was on the second missionary journey, Paul and Silas, and even though neither of them may have made it to Athens, at least not in time for the sermon that was preached on the Areopagus, Timothy did come through and deliver. Therefore, brothers, in our persecution and distress, we were encouraged concerning you by your faith. So faith is what it all matters. This is the most potent and necessary and essential virtue of a faith-filled life, and a spiritually supreme one, or spiritually superior, however we want to call it. It's all about faith, and distress is necessary to refine the faith, because the faith would grow stale and stagnant if there was nothing to oppose it. If it was all sunshine and weather and fair weather and growth and life, and not pain and suffering and persecution and affliction, then there could be no faith worth having, because faith that is not tested is faith that is not proven, and faith that is not proven cannot be approved, which is what we're all after for. Because as we now live, if you stand fast in the Master, for what thanks we are able to return to Elohim for you, for all the joy with which we rejoice for your sakes in the presence of our Elohim. So he's saying because we now live, he's not dead yet. So as he has life in him, if they have life in them, the we is plural this time, unlike in the opening verse. of the 3rd chapter. If you have life in you, you may as well stand the steady ground, maintain the straight and narrow, withstand yourself against the storms and the windstorms and the obstacles which are going to come your way. They're appointments, not accidents. But stand fast in the Messiah at all hazard and cost, and then he will be able to, he already is gratefully minded towards the Elohim for the joy that they had inspired, that they had basked in his presence and were living the teachings as has been communicated and taught to them by Paul. We rejoice. He rejoiced for their sakes in the presence of our Elohim. So he had intimate access there. He was visited by divine beings, and he had access to the presence of Elohim, and there he rejoiced for their sake. So it wasn't all about Paul. It was about them at that particular occasion. Night and day, praying exceedingly to see your face and make complete what is lacking in your faith. So night and day is not 2 set times of the day. It doesn't mean a scheduled rote where we play first thing in the morning or last thing at night or anywhere in between. It means that we are praying day, night, mid-afternoon, early morning, early evening, nighttime itself, midnight, and if we're awake beyond that, it's really an all-day endeavor, praying exceedingly night and day. So there's an element of quantity, and the contents of the prayer is to behold the people he was united to with in heart and spirit, in the presence, in the flesh, eye to eye, face to face, and also to correct whatever doctrinal lapses they were, because without his guidance and intimate instruction, these false teachers crept in just about every single church he planted and distorted and corrupted what he had taught. So Paul wanted to be there in order to correct any doctrinal misassumptions or errors that had crept in unaware without his presence being there. And our Elohim and Father himself, and our Master Yahshua Messiah, direct our way to you. So he's praying on the single greatest powers. He wants it to do, the Father and the Son, to give him the direction and the path and the momentum and the propeller to make their way to you. So the way is a way that has a destination. The way is straight and narrow, but it does lead to the infinite ones. And the Master make you increase and overflow in love to each other and to all, as we also do to you. So this is a righteous prayer. We should be praying that the love increase of every man's person, every person we know's heart might be increased, and there's no such thing as a lack of love, or there is such a thing, but it should be avoided like the plague. But when we overflow with love in our hearts, when it exudes the very fiber of our beings, when we are self-sacrificial to our neighbors, our brothers, the strangers, and even our enemies, that is when we are living the love that can only come from the one who loved us enough to send his own Son to die in order to provide the righteousness that we can make it to heaven on our behalfs. And of course, Paul did not suffer from this lack of love for them. You remember, he's always in their thoughts. He's always on their mind. He's praying constantly for them. And to establish your hearts blameless and sacred before our Elohim and Father at the coming of our Master Yahshua Messiah, with all the saints. So there is this chapter's reference to the second coming, and that might have been one of the reasons the Latin Vulgates arranged it as they did. They wanted to have an inclusion of one, and that way is one way of doing it, and I have mixed feelings about it. But what he's praying for is that they can have the blamelessness which can only come from the blameless one, without which Elohim does not look. His sacred nature rejects the presence of anything that is defiled or sinful or defective spiritually before him. So we can only become blameless in the Messiah, and we read of this, and he writes of this in First Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, or somewhere thereabouts. But the coming of the Messiah is going to be with all his saints. So at that moment, he's coming for not just one of us, but all of us. And it is a collectively glorious moment. And I hope that's the reason you're here. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Take care until then. Bye-bye.